Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Chris Whalen, banker, citizen, author. Welcome back.
Hello, Max.
All right, so you famously predicted Trump would win on this show.
Yep.
What do you make of the Trump administration so far? The media hates him, markets love him.
It's the government you love to hate. They remind me a lot of my family. You know, both of my parents come from Queens, and I was driving by the Trump Pavilion today on the Van Wyck Expressway, which is one of Fred's original apartment buildings. It's now an assisted living center. And so I get it. If you think of his association with Roy Cohn, the kind of way he approaches everything in his life, the narcissism, yeah, it reminds me a lot of my family.
Well, it's New York, you know.
No, but it's Queens.
Yeah.
Queens is different.
Tell the people in the international audience what the difference between Queens and New York.
Blue-collar working folk who are not afraid to be prejudiced and express it in very colorful language.
How come, like, the New Yorker or the New York Times likes to portray Trump as an elitist New Yorker? He's not.
No, he's not. He's just the opposite of that.
He's a working class guy.
A veneer of elitism, thanks to his hardworking dad and luck. You know, he could have been wiped out many times. Remember, I worked at Bear Stearns. Remember, Trump casinos. And after it was restructured a couple times, the banks took the money away, and they said, we'll pay you to use your name. And so today he owns golf courses. That's all he's got, really. And the name, which has got a lot of brand power, depending on how you feel about Trump.
All right, so the markets, though, are hitting these new all-time highs, very high levels. And Trump likes to tweet about it and say, aha, you see, another new high. Is he right to take credit for it?
No. Politicians have nothing to do with this. The most powerful person in Washington, Janet Yellen, the Fed chair. She doesn't like chairmen, so we're just a chair. We could be a sofa. But anyway, she is really doing this. You've taken $3 trillion worth of stock out of the market. You've driven interest rates down to nothing.
Through buybacks.
Yeah, we have bubbles everywhere. And then you have global central banks. You have this former Goldman banker named Mario Draghi buying so much paper, he's literally run out of things to buy. And in Japan, the same thing.
But
So
is there a risk of taking the entire market private?
we are. We're just printing little bitcoins.
Capitalism is over, essentially.
No, capitalism died 100 years ago with the robber barons. I've always maintained that.
Okay, so here you have a
put the kibosh.
post-robber baron, pseudo-capitalist era being fueled by the deregulation of the 80s coming to an end, because if you say $3 trillion of the securities are taken off the market and all the money is free to do stock repurchases, mergers and acquisitions.
That's right. Credit has no cost.
When you end up as basically beyond robber barons, it's lords and serfs, because you'll have a few private equity guys, Warren Buffett, and you won't even have a stock. The stock owning public is already quite small, and that's set to become virtually zero.
Well, it's the perfection of crony capitalism, because the private equity guys and Mr. Amazon and Mr. Google and all the rest of them, they can't do what they're doing unless they have the connivance and the support of the political class. Because what do we have here, Max? We have large monopolies. We used to show them as octopi and, you know, all kinds of nasty creatures in the day of J.P. Morgan and Gould and the rest of them. But today, the robber barons are actually politicians. They have fulfilled Mark Twain's, wisdom. And you wonder, what would Twain say today about politicians and their lackeys in the regulatory class? Because you were right, we had this roaring, party going, but now we've swung all the way over to Calvinist punishment. And the political class has been extracting billions and billions of dollars from mortgage companies and banks, everybody else, all to feed their own constituencies, right? So how do you tell the difference between the rapacious monopolist and their political enabler?
Is the social contract broken?
No, we don't have a social contract.
But, John Locke said if it breaks, it's up to Americans, or not Americans, but it's up to there should be a revolution. Is a revolution overdue?
No, well, that's what Trump is. Trump is a reaction to rule by experts, rule by technocrats. Think about it. Herbert Hoover was probably the greatest technocrat to ever hold the presidency. But then you have somebody like Barack Obama, who is more of a new age figure. He's a great salesman.
Hoover's a technocrat because why?
Well, he was an engineer. I mean, he was a very orderly thinker. If you read his memoirs of the 30s, it's laid out perfectly. But he didn't know what to do.
He came after Coolidge. Coolidge was a free market guy.
And he was a Democrat.
Okay.
Everybody thinks of him as Mr. Republican, but in fact, he had run for the Democratic presidential nomination before.
Okay, so he was very laissez-faire. Markets hit all-time highs. Shoeshine boys were buying stocks, and we had the crash of '29 and the Depression. We're saying here that the market's at risk of going private, and that there is no real.
Well, think of it this way.
What is the possible pin that could pop? I mean, aside from interest rates going up, because we're saying they're not going to go up, but is there another pin that could pop the bubble out there on the horizon? The people, a risk that's not being adequately discounted by current prices.
No, the risk is in our face. It's staring right at us, which is that we've loosed these economists, these supposed, experts at the central banks. They buy everything. What happens when they stop? Do we readjust? Because income hasn't gone up. We're not richer. We've just manipulated all these asset
income
classes.
does not go up.
No.
Wages have not gone up, but we have asset prices going up. So at some point, when they just run out of things to buy, there's no thing. The Ponzi scheme effectively comes to an end. It's a Ponzi. You're describing a Ponzi scheme.
Totally. Well, you start in Japan. They're the worst off. They are slowly being eaten by accrued interest. It's a big Pac-Man kind of monster. And then the Europeans are right behind them. If you let rates go up in Europe, the Italians are done. The Spanish are probably done too. And France, it's funny, I was just over in the Netherlands. Northern Europe's great. Holland, Germany, the Scandinavian countries are booming. But you get down to France and further south, and it's like a completely different market. They aren't enjoying any kind of expansion at all. So when you look at the debt, you look at the dead banks. 2/3 of the banks in Europe are dead, Max. So they pretend they're okay. But that's what Draghi is doing. He's got the corpse on the table, and he's keeping it nice and cold.
All right, let's talk about healthcare for a second. So Trump failed to repeal Obamacare, so the unsubsidized remain saddled with premiums. That'd be me. That continue to soar, and taxpayers continue to pick up the soaring subsidy bill. The Democrats are fighting to maintain this abusive system. Your thoughts?
We get what we want. I mean, there are a lot of Republicans supported it. Once you extend an entitlement, it doesn't go away. And I think that the pain of going at that constituency in any way, causing concern among the elderly or their families, is so high that they're not going to go there. You could just see it. All the Republicans who talked about changing it, when they came to the very point of making a decision, no, they had to back away. And I think that's why it didn't get done. It wasn't just this comic theater that we have at the White House. That's another issue. But once this was put in place, even though it makes no sense, and even though the subsidies, like you said, are gushing out at every orifice, right? No, they're not going to mess with it until they have to. See, Washington doesn't function until it has to. You have to have an apocalyptic crisis to get them serious enough to do something, like in the 1930s. That was awful. We haven't had awful yet. The central banks bailed us out in 2008. They kept throwing money at it. That's all they've done for 10 years, Max.
Okay, as a side note, you're in the industry,
Yep.
and so the chatter around the water cooler, if they existed anymore, but the equivalent thereof. So you're in the industry, and so for people? I mean, you're in New York, you're in the industry, you're explaining to us a lot of the ways that the system is unsustainable, or crony capitalism, et cetera. So what's your plan? Your plan is to head for the hills at the appropriate moment before it blows up? I mean, you're not working on reforming the system, right?
Oh, no, I am, in my own little way.
In your own way. I mean, you're commenting on the system.
Yeah, and you go after certain abusive aspects of it, sure.
But this is the industry. You live in New York. This is the primary driver of economics in New York is this industry. You're here. You're in the industry. I'm not saying that you are causing it. I'm just saying that.
Thank you, man.
What does your group of friends think about this? Because if it does blow up at some point, what happens after that?
Well, the U.S. won't blow up first. In relative terms, they're better off. They have less debt, more liquidity, a lot of advantages, relative respect for private property compared to the rest of the world. That's why all the money's coming here. We've been sucking all the capital out of the rest of the world with zero interest rates. Think about that. But it's because of the stock market, real estate. There's a lot of asset classes here that have been going to the moon. So over time, Japan, I think, is first. The Chinese are interesting. They love debt. They love debt more than we do. And then the Europeans are a mess. And in each case, nobody really wants to deal with it. So it'll just sit there and percolate until the pot boils over.
Okay, so the answer is that it's bad, but it's not as bad, relatively speaking.
No.
Okay.
So I don't have an escape plan to answer your question.
All right. So to follow up on the healthcare for a second, he said it won't change until it gets catastrophically bad. But in the meantime, small, medium, and large enterprises in the U.S. have to compete against other developed nations that don't have this screwed up system.
That's right.
So the apocalypse is here. The problem is here. Is it time to rid the U.S. business of this expense, and other nations don't have to incur it?
What, in other words, withdraw, bring everyone home?
Yeah.
No more troops getting killed in Niger and, the rest of it. Look, I thought it was interesting that Mr. McCain was in the press today, talking about how we have to go to war in Kurdistan. I can't decide who's a greater warmonger, John McCain or George Soros. Think about that. We have Soros in Ukraine. We have McCain with his fingerprints all over the Middle East. Yeah. It's a horror show.
I want to talk about Soros. He's an interesting character.
Well, he convinced Ukrainians
because he's a Wall Street guy
that they could go to war with Russia, which was obviously a bad idea.
He co-founded Quantum Fund with Jim Rogers.
Yes.
And he's a hedge fund guy. That's how he started off, and then he's become the go-to guy. Him and the Rothschilds are the guy. The pointing finger at those two guys. They're the guys who are orchestrating all the color revolutions and social unrest. And so, how did he make that transformation? What is it in the George Soros persona? Because he is a kind of another Wall Street character, another New York character to some degree. What is it about him that he became this way? How did that happen?
Well, first he beat the British. When he broke the pound, that kind of gave him, and I think a lot of other funds, so you look at Elliott, the way they went after Argentina, there are a number of big players who have enough cash behind them that they can...
Paul Singer.
Sure.
Yeah.
They can sit at the big table and actually threaten governments.
Right.
So that's where he got his power and the gravitas that he's acquired over the years. Unfortunately, he has also decided, much like Mike Bloomberg and a lot of other very wealthy people, that they can tell everyone else what to do.
Right. Okay.
And they can play
that's
the
a good
game.
point. So when Soros broke the Bank of England, made $1 billion shorting the pound, basically made a huge score. This put him into a league where he decided, you know what, I'm part of the folks that are going to run this world, essentially. So hedge fund manager turned potentate.
Well, the funds have, relative to, say, 20, 30 years ago, so much cash and so much access to credit that they dwarf the central banks. The Fed's right. They are too small. That's their problem. The ECB is quite small relative to the amount of cash sloshing around in the market, which, of course, they created. Think of it this way. You're a Bitcoin fan. When FDR began the attack on gold and Nixon finally cuts off the window in the 70s, right? That allows you to create as much money as you want. It's not linked to anything anymore. So that creates all of this firepower for funds who know how to play the game. Ray Dalio.
We got to cut it off there. Fascinating. Wish we could go on, but we got to cut it off. Thanks for being on the show.
My pleasure.
All right, well, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Chris Whalen. He is the author and all too around nice guy whose recent book is called Ford Men. Until next time, bye, y'all.